Ms. Dyer, thank you very much. I would like to begin by just making sure that I can be heard okay, because I've been having some technical issues today with my internet.
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent, thank you. So I would like to welcome everyone to a talk with the finance doctor, your RX for Forex, where we're continuing this dialogue and now entering into a conversation where we can explore all of the avenues that allow us to continue to grow in economic empowerment. It is, to me, very important that we continue to walk in the power of the unmuted mic, that we address those topics and issues that you think will help you to continue to be your own bank, to continue to help us to touch 1 million families. Those of you that receive shout outs from the Trade Whisperer, I also share in those sentiments. It's always a wonderful thing when we jump in here and we do what we're supposed to do, and we continue to operate in the right way with the right attitude, one video at a time. African proverb: how does an ant eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So please know that any efforts that you take is getting you closer to mastering this skill. And here's the thing: we'll never really truly master it because this world just moves too quickly. The moment we master a particular type of currency pair, then there'll be another one coming out. The moment we master a certain technology, there'll be a new one coming out. So what we want to do is operate in the mindset of the shirt that I love that IML has, always a student. We're teachers, we're coaches, but we are also students. We're students first. And it is being a student that allows you to continue to grow, to expand your mindset, and to put yourself in the best position to maximize this opportunity that we have in IML. I would like to pause for a second and briefly just get your mind back into the conversation that we had on Tuesday about our mindset, about developing relationships, about being responsible and accountable for our reaction. And I just wanted to open it up and see if, sometimes when we talk about something like that, it germinates and it sprouts later. So if there were any situations from Tuesday to Thursday in which you had some revelations, some thoughts, some comments, some testimonies that you'd like to share, I'd like to open it up now if anybody would like to make any comments about that conversation. If you missed Tuesday's call, I would suggest that you go and listen to it. And the reason why I'm making that suggestion is because I know how powerful the collective consciousness is. That even if you were absent on Tuesday, single person, every single rectangle represented by this Zoom call could benefit from that reminder. No new information on that call, just reminding you who you are and reminding you the most efficient way for you to manage your emotions. And you managing your emotions, you being responsible and accountable for your reactions, it literally speaks directly to your ability to be able to trade. Is the PSAR important? Absolutely. But a peaceful mind will see the PSAR quicker. Is understanding the rules and knowing your own risk tolerance important? Absolutely. But your ability to be able to dial into your risk tolerance and understand exactly what is for you is directly predicated on how smooth your emotions are, how balanced you are, how you can find your center, how connected you are to spirit. So one more time, any questions, comments, testimonies about that conversation? Be your own bank. Being your own bank is obviously a philosophy. It's obviously a concept. But I think that sometimes we need to remind ourselves how we got here historically because it puts us in the right perspective to be able to see the changing trends, to see the shifts in the macroeconomic market, and to be able to prepare ourselves for it. So in our quest to be your own bank, I want to take you on a very quick history lesson. Prior to 1933, banks ran every single component of financial transactions. Anything that anybody wanted to do economically or financially, there was only one institution that allowed you to do it, and that was the bank. So here's an example. A couple of days ago in an academic financial setting, I was talking about the coupon rate, which is a simple, fancy way of saying the interest rate that's paid on a bond. So if you invest in a bond, the interest rate that you get on that bond is called a coupon rate. So I was explaining to the group that the reason why it's called a coupon rate is because prior to 1933, if you invested in a bond, there was no computer network, there was no certificate that was mailed to you, there was no mail. So you would walk up to the bank and you would say, hey, I just invested such and such amount of money in this bond, and they give you a big sheet of coupons. And then every 6 months, you'd tear the coupon off, and you'd walk up to the bank, and you'd give them your coupon, and they would give you your interest payment. So to this day, even though there hasn't physically been a coupon since prior to 1933, we still call it a coupon rate. And that's one of the reasons why I make such a big deal about us asking that why question. If you know what you're doing, you always have a job. If you know why you're doing it, you will always be the boss. So I said all that to say this. 1933, pre-1933, any financial transaction that you ever had to do, it was done at a bank. Well, something happened very interestingly in the decade prior to 1933. This decade was called the 1920s, or the Roaring Twenties. Now, a lot of people think that it was called the Roaring Twenties simply because the car was invented in that time and cars make a roaring sound. But in reality, the reason why it was called the Roaring Twenties is because it was the first time in our history that economically we had very strong uptrends. How many times tonight did we talk about uptrends? Well, that wasn't something that we experienced in the 1920s world. So because the 1920s was so big in terms of there being a steep incline in stocks, company values, earnings, we called it the Roaring Twenties. Now, if we're really going to understand the concept of the 1920s, you really have to go back 30 years before that. We've got to go back to the 1890s, because the 1890s was big because that was the first time that we ever used technology in order to have sustainable business. I mentioned this the other day when I was talking about cryptocurrency. Prior to 1890, every single industry, every single measure of wealth, every single measure of abundance was agriculture based. So you basically had land or crops or animals. That was how you gained wealth. So in 1890, we had these things called steam engines and railroads and other different types of technology. So it was so big that this was the first time that we actually were able to make money off of industry. We called it the Industrial Revolution. Why was it a revolution? Because it's the first time we moved away from agriculture and moved into technology making money. So by the time we laid the infrastructure for all that, and by the time companies really started doing well based on that, it was the 1920s. And the 1920s roared. The Roaring Twenties. Now, I think that there's a value in understanding the way in which supply and demand works. Why is there a value in understanding supply and demand? Well, for one thing, every single trade that we make, every single indicator that we look at in the foreign exchange market is based on supply and demand. So having an understanding of how supply and demand works puts us in a better position. Also, as we begin to get better and better at our learning platform and its educational platform and understanding how trades work, we're going to have more and more money that we're going to need to manage. So from our buying patterns to our business patterns to when we actually become our own bank and provide capital to individuals that may not have provided capital for in the past, as we do all of that, we need to understand supply and demand so we know how to set ourselves up. So there are a plethora of reasons why we need to understand supply and demand. So here is a very interesting but consistent fact that happens with macro economies. When there's a very high growth rate, meaning this company, this firm, this industry, this area starts doing really well. So we had record profits, record earnings, record dividends being paid to investors. And by the way, if I say a single term that you're not 100% comfortable with, stop me, because that's how we learn. So basically, when companies are experiencing very high growth, one of the things they do is they purchase infrastructure based on the fact that the growth is really high. I'll just give you an example right now. I'm packing for a trip tomorrow. I'm going to Atlanta for a basketball tournament, last one of the season. And my daughter was standing in the closet and she was like, "Pops, you need some more gear." Okay, all right, I'll take that. 52 is the new 82. She's telling me I need some more gear. So as you continue to make more and more money, as you become more and more wealthy, then some of the clothes that are in your closet, you're going to have to get rid of them and replace them with other clothes. So that's what managers do when companies are doing really well. What they do is they begin to build infrastructure based on the increase of demand. So what I'm saying to you is this. This year, I've got huge profits. So what I'm going to do is to purchase additional infrastructure so I can handle the growth and expansion for next year. But here's the thing that continues to happen over and over. And you and I having this conversation and being able to identify it, we put ourselves in a better position to be stronger managers, not only of our households, but of all of our businesses. What individuals normally do is what is called overcapacity. Once things start going well, you don't expect them to go poorly. You expect them to continue to go up. So what managers do is they purchase too much infrastructure based on their anticipation that demand next year will be as high as it was this year. That growth next year will be as high as it was last year. But guess what happens? 9 times out of 10, A, the growth is not as high next year. And 9 times out of 10, the fact that they purchased so much infrastructure based on the expectation of demand, then it exacerbates the problem. And so now you got a manager that bought all of this infrastructure preparing for a higher demand, but it never comes. So guess what the firm, the company, the town, the organization, the industry, guess what they have to do? They have to cut back. And what I just said to you, what I just explained to you is the macroeconomic reason why there are business cycles. There are business cycles because of overcapacity. Companies do well, so they buy stuff based on the expectation that they're going to do well again, then they don't do as well, and they bought all this infrastructure, and now they're going to have to cut back. Now think about it. This is not about us complaining about what happens. This is about us understanding what happens so we can empower ourselves to do things a little bit better, understanding that this macroeconomic flow continues to happen. What do you think, I'm asking rhetorically, what do you think is the number one expense or the number one cost for companies? Labor, people, human resources, salary. So when people get laid off, this is why they get laid off, because of this economic concept I just explained to you called overcapacity. Growth is high. We buy infrastructure based on it being high next year. It's not. We already bought the infrastructure. Now we got to cut back. So I said all of that to say this. In the 1920s, it was roaring. We had bigger growth rates than we'd ever seen before in the history of the United States market. It was huge. So guess what all the companies did? They started investing in infrastructure. As you and I become better and better at doing what we do, we're going to be managing more people than just our household. So having conversations like this allows us to be in a better position, not only to manage our trades, but to manage our businesses and manage all of the infrastructure that we're going to be responsible for in the future. We've already established, we're changing paradigms here. We're not doing this to stay the same. We're doing this to grow and expand. And when we do, we'll be managing processes just like this one. So in the 1920s, overcapacity was bigger than it normally is because the growth was bigger than it normally was. And all the companies started buying a whole bunch of stuff in preparation that these growth rates will continue. A very interesting thing happened. Remember, I told you that banks handle all financial transactions. So this is the two main roles that banks did prior to 1933. Number one, they took deposits and they loaned out money. That's called the commercial banking profit model. They took deposits and then they used the money for the deposits and they made loans. And they obviously paid this much on deposits, charged this much on the loans. That's how banks make money. That was their first function. The second function that banks did was that they were responsible for controlling the process when companies decided to raise capital. When they decided to issue stock and have individuals invest in their company. When they decided to issue bonds and have individuals lend them money. There's a little known fact. We've all heard of bonds, but we may not have recognized that a bond is just a loan. Literally, a company is borrowing money from someone and they call it a bond. Why is it called a bond? It's called a bond because if you think about it, if a company borrows, and by the way, let me back up. Bonds are in $1,000 increments. So if you invest in a bond, you're basically loaning a company $1,000. So let me ask you a question, again, rhetorically. If you loaned $1,000 to a corporation, the corporation decided not to pay you, what are you going to do? Of course, you're going to sue. Are you aware that the average retainer in the Tampa Bay area is $2,500 to start? So you're going to pay $2,500 for a lawyer to get back $1,000? So the government knows that corporations pretty much have you in a precarious situation. So the company is bonded by law to pay you back. That is the reason why it's called a bond. If you know what you're doing, you will always have a job. If you know why you're doing it, you will always be the boss. So basically, banks were responsible for helping corporations to raise capital, whether it was through bonds or through stocks. So a very interesting thing happened because not only were banks responsible for those two roles, but they also were free to invest in the stocks of companies. So if you haven't seen it yet, this created a pretty incestuous relationship because think about it. I'm the company that's loaning money to companies, but I'm also the company that's helping companies raise capital through investors. But I'm also invested in the stocks of these very companies. So when overcapacity hit in the 1920s and companies started doing poorly, guess what they did? They went to the banks and said, yo, bank, you gotta loan me some more money. Well, banks could easily see that based on the macroeconomic force of overcapacity and the fact that companies had purchased way too much infrastructure to handle the decreasing demand for all products, it was obvious that they should not be loaned more money. However, because the banks were invested in the stocks of the companies, they looked the other way and they loaned the money anyway. So what happened was the economic downturn became worse. That's why it's called the Great Depression that occurred at the end of the 1920s. Because what was happening was the depression was made greater by this incestuous relationship that banks had with companies. So the federal government was like, nah, player, that's it. We're never going to go through that again, because this situation is so devastating to our people. I don't know if you've ever talked to anybody who's been through the Great Depression. I have. Individuals who go through the Great Depression, they never get rid of that experience. They don't trust banks. I literally counseled a woman. Actually, I got a better example. I counseled a Tuskegee airman, and he had $55,000 in cash at his house because he didn't trust banks, because he grew up in the Great Depression. So all I'm saying is, it's not a rumor the Great Depression was great. So what the federal government said is, all right, from now on, we're nipping this in the bud. So the first thing they came up with in 1933 with a law called Glass-Steagall was this: from now on, banks are not allowed to hold stocks in companies. That's it. Getting rid of the incest, they're not allowed to do it. Second, they took those two functions that banks did and they separated them out. And they said one function, we're going to call it commercial banking. Then they took the other function and said, we're going to call it investment banking. Think about what happens when you go onto the web analyzer and you hear our mentor and coach, Mr. Gerald D. Rogers, talk about why the web analyzer is such a powerful tool. He references the investment banking world. So as of 1933, to protect ourselves from going through any other situation like that, we took commercial banks, made them one entity. We made investment banks, made them another entity. When I tell this story, when I go to this historical underpinning of what it's like to be a bank so we can truly be our own bank, I like to use as an example that one of the main investment banks back in the day was J.P. Morgan. And one of the main banks back in the day was Chemical Bank, who eventually became Chase Bank. So now we've got these new rules in place. It's 1933. So from 1933 until, say, the 1990s, we were operating in that way. Why did you do air quotes, finance doctor? I did air quotes because the rule says banks are not allowed to invest in stocks. You ever thought about the fact that Citibank has an umbrella company called Citicorp? Have you ever thought about the fact that Chase Bank has an umbrella called Chase Corporation? I can go on and on and on, because what banks did was they became bank holding companies that held the bank. The bank's not allowed to invest in the stock, but the bank holding company still is. So now let's fast forward to the 1990s. Actually, let's go back. Let's go back to the 1920s. 1920s, the reason why it was roaring is because of all the high growth. But let me give you a little bit of the infrastructure on why the high growth happened. I mentioned that some people identify the roaring with the car. Well, the automobile was big in the 1920s. And the automobile was a new technology. It was a new technology that pretty much took the country by storm. And one of the things that happens when you look at macroeconomic bank markets or macroeconomic industries is that if one company, one industry is doing very well, other industries start doing well as a result. So the auto was doing so well that other entities like the rubber company or the companies that made the tires or the companies that made the machines or steel or different infrastructure that's used to create the auto, they start doing well as well. And then by the time the end of the 20s happened, it exploded. In the 1990s, there was a new technology that came out that was unlike any technology we'd ever seen before. And it was called the internet. Those of us who were alive in the 1990s, if you think about it, everything was .com. So the same buzz we had about the automobile, we had the same buzz about the internet. And growth rates were through the roof. I used to do this investment philosophy, and I called it the Super Bowl halftime show investment philosophy. And I would go around the country teaching this philosophy, and it was very effective. This is what I would do. Every year during the Super Bowl, I would record those companies that were first-time advertisers on the Super Bowl. If you remember back then, it was like $1 million for a second. It was just crazy how much the Super Bowl halftime show commercials were. Super Bowl commercials, not halftime show, Super Bowl commercials. And in order for this philosophy to work, it had to be first-time individuals. Like, for example, Pepsi did it every year, but the first year Pepsi did it, that's a huge investment you're making in yourself. So if you know you're making a huge investment in yourself for the first time, that means you're about to do that incline we're talking about. You're about to roar. So the Super Bowl first-time commercial philosophy worked very well. I said all that to say this. In the 1990s, I already had a list. I've been doing it since the 80s. I had a list of all the first-time commercials, all the first-time companies that had commercials. In the 1990s, there was a year in the early 1990s where there were 33 .com companies that were first-time advertisers on the Super Bowl commercials list. Now, that was the only year that the philosophy didn't work, because every other year, if they started it, they kept doing it. But the overcapacity in the internet market was so big, there was so much put into .com, they overdid it. None of those companies, well, 11 of those 33 companies came back. 11, guess what one of them was? Amazon. So my point to you is the same thing happened in the 1990s as happened in the 1920s. And in 1999, we passed a new law called the Financial Services Modernization Act. And the Financial Services Modernization Act says, in parentheses, repeal of the Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall is what they put in place in 1933 to keep banks in check. But in 1999, they repealed it. Remember, I talked about the fact that they split up those two functions. Commercial banks are over here and investment banks are over here. And I told you that Chemical Bank was a big bank back then that became Chase. And I told you that JP Morgan was an investment bank. Hey, wait a minute. Aren't JP Morgan and Chase the same company? So the very mechanism that we stripped apart so that we can maintain the integrity of the banking system and not be affected by bank runs. What's a bank run? A bank run is where everybody starts to become nervous about their money. So they go to the bank and ask for their money. Whether you realize it or not, banks only keep a small fraction of money on site. So when everybody started becoming nervous, they all went at the same time. There wasn't enough money for them to give their deposits, so it made the Great Depression greater. So what's your point, finance doctor? What do we take from this? What we take from this is, if you think about it, in the 1920s, there was no governmental interaction that was involved to maintain balance. So the Great Depression became great, and it became great very quickly. But in the 1990s, we pretty much did the same exact thing we did in the 1920s. However, the federal government, the Federal Reserve, and by the way, there was no Federal Reserve System prior to 1933. So the Federal Reserve System, the federal government, open market operations took place. So you can now do things to make it seem like there's not an issue. So was the Depression great? Yes, but we just didn't call it great. Was there an economic downturn? Yes, we just didn't say that there was an economic downturn. And because we kept turning the other way and not really realizing nor admitting that we were in this situation, it wasn't until 2007 that it finally hit the wall. So what do we take out of this? What we take out of this is the understanding that if we're going to be our own bank, we have to understand how banks operate. If we're going to be our own bank, we have to understand how macroeconomic facilities work. We need to understand how we can take what we're doing right now take our foreign exchange trading, take our cryptocurrency trading, take our ability to be able to manage all of the processes that we need to manage for economic empowerment, and put ourselves in a position where we understand just how banks operate. Is this about understanding their mistakes and doing something different? Yes. Is this about understanding the way banks operate and putting ourselves in a position where we're not affected by it? Yes. So this conversation is literally a historical trip back down the history of banking and look at how it impacts what's going on right now. Because literally, we are watching the financial institutions transition from paper currency to cryptocurrency. We're watching major technologies taking place in our society. And by understanding how it works, think about all the individuals from 1920 to the present who have been laid off because all they were doing was looking at that job, having no idea that there are macroeconomic forces that will cause overcapacity, which will cause them to be part of the layoff about decisions they didn't even make. So by us looking at what's going on, by us identifying the way overall industries work, it makes us more powerful. Does it help our trading? Of course. Does it put us in a position where we can understand how the markets are affecting our trades? Absolutely. But we also have to prepare ourselves for what we do post-trade. What is our mechanism of evaluating and managing our finances post-trade? And having conversations like this puts us in a better position to do so. By understanding our history, we put ourselves in the best position to have a new experience, to see the writing on the wall, to see that these patterns just occur every 20 to 30 years. This conversation is about us taking a pause just for a second and maximizing our macroeconomic view so we can truly do what we come here to do, which is to be our own bank. Thank you very much for your attention. And I will now turn this call back over to our host and our hostess.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Bytewood. This has definitely been a power-packed evening. This night was about catching pips. This night was about understanding why we do what we're doing. This is how we're going to financially impact and empower, financially educate, impact, empowering those 1 million families. This is definitely where it begins. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm excited because this weekend, this is the Leadership and Development Conference. I will see you this Saturday, Leadership and Development Conference. This weekend, this Saturday, you've accepted the challenge. You are creating those distribution centers. You are creating those ATM machines. This is exactly where you want to be. Make sure, if you're not already registered, you will have to pay at the door, but I will see you there. I will see you there this Saturday. This is an event. What I will tell you now is that this is an event that you do not want to miss. This Saturday, this is an event that you do not want to miss. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot wait. I cannot wait for what's to come. We've had the 3 pre-events leading up to this event, and it has been phenomenal. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, you all have a wonderful and blessed evening. I will see you this weekend, and this will officially conclude this call.